Thank you very much for the invitation to speak this morning. And can I say that just before I start on this particular topic, I'm going to actually answer a couple of people who asked about part-time PhDs. I did my PhD part-time when I was the Associate Dean of the university, and I had very late nights, I had very few holidays, and I'm a big fan of the burst. I worked in bursts, because otherwise I couldn't get through my day job. So those of you, the 2 hours a day I think is great, but work in bursts, that's the other thing to remember. So, just in case you're not familiar with the University of Glasgow, we are a very old university, the 4th oldest in the UK, 2nd oldest in Scotland. And we have a very large number of students, and we have a huge number of countries that the students come from. We're a Russell Group university. And despite what the appearance is, we were not used to film the Harry Potter films. This is not Hogwarts, although it does look like it. I appreciate that. However, the School of Education where I work is actually a much younger institution. We only came into being in 1999. You'd think after 500 years they might have realised they needed a School of Education a little before that, but hey, what can you do? So we actually have only been in place since the late 20th century. The institution I worked for before was a teacher education institution, and we had been going for about 100 years when we came into the university, so we do have a history that way. This is the research team that I'm going to talk about today. You'll see that picture in the middle, my younger, thinner, darker-haired self. And this is now quite a well-established research team. My colleague, Dr. Evelyn Arithpe, who is a world-renowned scholar in children's literature and picture book specialist, and my other colleague, Julie McAdam, also researching in the picture book area. Julie is a teacher educator, and she has worked in the Middle East for some time in teacher education. And the three of us have created a research team in the area of children's literature. And you might think that this is a kind of odd area to talk about research with impact. But I'm hoping to try and show you that these kinds of research are actually fabulously interesting. They do evoke the passion that was spoken about so earlier on. And it also is about finding ways to actually make things real in schools and in communities. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. The work that we're talking about addresses some of these areas of concern. Every report you look at in education talks about declining literacy standards. It's a huge issue. We can't get the kids to read. We also know that the world is a very changing place, that there are people migrating from all the different parts of the world, and those include the refugees and asylum seekers. And as a consequence of that, in our schools, we have a very much more diverse population. And as a result of that, we need many more multimodal and multilingual teaching strategies. How are we going to teach these kids? How are we going to engage these kids? And at the same time, how are we going to give their home languages and cultures a place in their new country? And that leads us to some very serious and important intercultural issues and a whole raft of issues about intercultural learning. So why did we get interested in this particular aspect? Well, one of the things you need to know about Glasgow is that we were one of 4 cities in the UK who were identified as dispersal cities. And that meant that we took many refugees and asylum seekers, and they were housed in Glasgow and dispersed from Glasgow. This says that there have been migration since the 1950s and the 1960s. Actually, there's been migration to Glasgow for much longer than that. My own family background is Irish, and there was a huge migration to Britain from Ireland in the potato famine in the 19th century. So, you know, although we're talking about very recent kind of events, it's been going for a very long time. Since the EU opened up, we've had an influx of economic migrants, and they have made a significant contribution to Glasgow school education system, and indeed some of the projects I'm going to talk about this morning. About 15% of the children in Glasgow speak English as an additional language. And I think I am right in saying that at the last count, there were 147 languages spoken in Scotland. So it's not just a small issue, it's quite a big issue. And I put this last point up because this is a quote from an inspectorate report on school education, which says that the same weaknesses continued to exist with newly arrived children as have previously existed for 10 years or more. And I would say that was one of the things that galvanized the action for what we were going to do in our work. So let's talk about journeys with children's literature, and this is a picture from the book I'm going to talk about in just a second. So the work that we were doing was with wordless picture books. Let's take a look at why they are so important. We know the very, very first book that we consider a picture book is Comenius's Orbis Sensualium Pictus from the 17th century. And we know that we use visual aids, we use pictures all the time. And so important, if you've ever built anything from IKEA, you know that you use pictures to help you to build it. You don't need the words. But they have, the picture books that are now being generated have immense sophistication, hugely enjoyable, and they are a challenge at times to read. They have been used, as I've mentioned here, for language and literacy teaching, teaching about the environment, teaching about multiculturalism, about which we'll speak in a moment, and they have also been used increasingly in bibliotherapy. Now that's quite a new area for us to look at, and unfortunately we don't have a huge amount of time to talk about that today. One of the major Canadian scholars on picture books is Perry Nodelman, and he says this: as artifacts of our own culture, picture books require and help us to construct readers and viewers who will take their place in that culture. I love that idea that these books will construct these readers and viewers. And you'll see this rather exotic picture in the corner, and you'll notice that all of the pictures have been in black and white, or I suppose we would call sepia, you know, like an old photograph. But it's a very futuristic looking picture, about more of which in a second. So here's some more of the research that we know about picture books. It allows a creative space for diverse readers to engage with image and words, no matter what their experience. And here's what we know about children whose first language is not English, that by engaging with these picture books, it increases and improves their linguistic repertoire. They are far better at expressing themselves. Sometimes children who've never previously contributed, after working with us, began to contribute in the class, and class teachers often were astonished at their responses. It allows the students to talk about their own knowledge and experience, and it allows them to begin to negotiate cultural understandings. And I think, again, something we should not take for granted, allows them to understand better the emotional experiences, complex emotional experiences, such as migration. Some of the children that we worked with had come to Scotland from about 4 different countries. They had gone from one country to another, spent some time to another. Some had come by clandestine means. We were told not to ask how they had got to the country in some cases. And that kind of experience is hugely traumatizing. So these are some of the research projects that I've been involved working with. I'm going to talk, because of time constraints, I'm going to talk about 2 of them today. The Visual Journeys, which was an international research project, and the Journeys from Images to Words. And I hate to say this because there's a lot of slides, but I know there's a time constraint. Some of the slides are illustrations and pictures. You will forgive me if I flip through them rather quickly, but I can leave the presentation and people can have access to them if you would like. So, this is Visual Journeys, an international research project, artwork courtesy of one of the children. And this actually became our flyer for the project. So, this was working particularly with children who were newly arrived in the country. And as you'll see, we had 4 major centres and 1 that came on board later. We were working in Glasgow in Scotland. We were working with colleagues in Barcelona. We were working with colleagues in Sydney in Australia, with colleagues in Arizona in the United States. And very late on in the game, the Italians from Bologna came on board. They heard us speak about the project at an early stage and wanted to get in on the act, and so they came and joined us as well. And we were looking at particularly wordless picture books, 2, one called The Arrival by Sean Tan. I bring the book with me. And one called Flotsam by David Wiesner. Now, most of the pictures I'm using for today are all from The Arrival. And what we were looking for was a response from the children, and we were also looking at how this could be used in the classroom to help them. So we were looking at small group discussions, something called annotated image spreads, and I'll show you examples of these in just a moment. We encouraged them to use photographs. We gave them, many of them did have mobile phones, but we gave them these little disposable cameras, the ones that you can just take the roll of film and then throw away. And we encouraged them to use graphic strips. You might know them better as comics. So this is The Arrival. It's a picture book, but there's dispute. Some people call it a graphic novel. It is an incredibly complex book. I've seen children aged 8 work with it. I've seen young adults aged 15 work with it. I've seen student teachers from their 20s and upwards work with it. And every one of them finds it engaging, annoying, challenging, interesting, thought-provoking. And Sean Tan, the illustrator, has won multiple awards for this book. And these are some of the pages, and so I'm going to just let you see an example of some of the pages from the book. Now, you'll notice, some of you might recognize there's a very famous picture of immigrants arriving in New York, and you can see shades of that in this, but also in that you can see these futuristic buildings, these strange statues, along with the steam puffer ship, which is really odd. This is a page from the man's arrival in the new country. The discussions that the children had with this, a lot of the kids, particularly the Glasgow home kids, thought that this man had been arrested, and this was him being examined before he was put into jail. Whereas the youngsters who had come as recent arrivals had some kinds of experiences like that, perhaps not quite as brutal as this one, but these kinds of things. You'll be glad to know that they settle happily in their new country after some trauma. So it's good to sort of start with that. So here are some of our questions, and it follows on so beautifully from the previous talk about what's your focus, why are you doing this research, how is it relevant, what is your research paradigm, what is the theory underpinning it, and all of this will be should hopefully emerge from this talk. So how can research about children's migrant experience work in a cross-national context? We were working in Glasgow where we had kids coming in from Afghanistan, from Bosnia, from all kinds of places like that. Our colleagues in America were very close to the Mexican border. They had a huge number of both legal and illegal immigrants. There were both Spain and Australia were having asylum seekers and refugees arrive too. So how does that work in that international research context? And more importantly, we were looking for a practical use. What can we actually do with this that will help promote inclusive communities and intercultural understanding in the classroom? In other words, what do we get out of this? What do our teachers get out of this? So here we are. I'm just going to fly through this because we don't have time to talk about it in huge detail, but it was a sociocultural investigative paradigm, and we took our theory from children's literature itself, the whole area of literacy studies, from education and from an ethnographic research point of view. And then we were working with these new multiliteracies. Those of us now who have, for example, if you have a Kindle, if you have an iPad, if you have an e-reader of some description, you will be reading books hard copy, you will be reading from your electronic device, you will be reading online, you are actually using multimodal literacy. So the children in our schools are coming up with this multimodal literacy. And if we don't teach them about it, we don't talk to them about it, then we are doing them a disservice. We also were looking at the work on English as an additional language and bilingualism, and something called migration studies. And I love this. We had a huge problem making sure we all understood the same thing about each of the terms. One of the very first presentations myself and my colleague Evelyn did in London, we talked about the immigrant children in Glasgow, and someone came up to us at the end and said, "We don't call them that." And we said, what should we call them? And that was where we were introduced to this term, newly arrived people. We did not mean anything pejorative about the term immigrants. We meant people who had come to our country. But that was just Scotland and England. I mean, you know, when you add Spain and America and Australia to that, we had a number of areas where we had to get our terms straight. So here's the main research question. How do recent immigrant children make meaning of wordless picture books? And in other words, what we were looking at was how their strategies that they use to make sense of these books. We were looking at their responses to their books. And we were also looking at any visual pedagogical methods we could use that we could then transfer to the classroom. And the qualitative interpretation was what we used, because, as you said earlier on, this was a values-driven piece. This was where we observed the children, we took notes, we recorded the children, transcribed the recordings, analysed according to a framework that we developed. And so we actually were able to classify some of their responses in a very meaningful way. So I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on the image-based strategies, and you'll see that we've got something called annotated spreads, and if I can, that's what we mean by an annotated spread, and you'll see this in a little more detail in a second. This was a photograph. May seem a strange thing to have a photograph of Harry Potter in the middle of this. This was a young Polish boy who had come to Glasgow. He was obsessed with Harry Potter. And these he wanted to bring in to show us his books, the Harry Potter books in Polish. He could tell us how many pages were in every single book. He was literally obsessed with them. And the last one is the graphic strip, which hasn't come out terribly well on that screen, but you'll see it a little bit better. And that's the comic strips that we used as we were going through. Now, this is a page from The Arrival. And what we used to do with this was we took a photocopy of the page in A4 size, and we superimposed that onto A3 paper. So there was a white border. And all we asked the children to do was to respond to what they could see. And they could ask questions, they could make a statement, they could wonder about what the situation was. And this actually is a combination, because you'll see that some of the writing is a child's writing. This was a girl that I worked with, and she, her written English was not great, and she started off doing her comments, but then she got frustrated because she couldn't say what she wanted to say. So I then scribed for her. So what you have round the outside is the scribings. And some of the things that are quite interesting, you'll see that, oops, hang on, let's jump back there. This here, she speculated that this was some kind of animal, some kind of tail. And she wanted to know what kind of animal this, what pet kind of thing this was. There's a bit that this down at the bottom, it says, he's standing at the people's, sorry, I need to get my glasses on for this. He's standing looking at people in the city. People in the city might tell him to go away because he's not like us. It looks like a place, I would rather go there with the creature. So I was scribing exactly what the children were saying. So it sometimes doesn't make complete sense. That's not even a portion of all the comments that were made about this. These children were really looking at the picture. Our colleagues in Australia, in Scotland we have something called the Curriculum for Excellence, and in English we have reading, writing, listening and talking. Our colleagues in Australia are way ahead of us, I reckon, because they have talking and listening, reading and writing, and viewing. So much of our world is visual now. We need to teach those interpretation skills in the same way as we teach reading skills. I've mentioned the Harry Potter thing before. This, you can see a little better, is the start of a graphic strip, a comic strip a young boy is giving us of his journey. And you'll notice that there are no words. They are used to this idea of no words. Here are some further examples. Now this one, the young man could not bear not to be able to write some words. So along the top we have the visual of his journey, and this was him. This was him coming to Glasgow via the plane, via the boat, all of these kinds of things. But he had to have his words underneath. I cut out a picture, I cut out a couple of slides to try and make this fit into the time slot we had. And one of the slides I've got, there's the graphic strip, and then this young girl was really frustrated, and she then wrote a full page telling the story. So this interesting mix of visual and the written word is hugely important. I want to talk a little bit about research with impact and research collaborative research. What was so fabulous about this project was that it was interdisciplinary. There were people coming from education, from literature, from all kinds of other kind of ethnographic studies backgrounds and so on. We were engaging with both the primary literature, which is obviously the picture books themselves, and all the secondary research literature that came with it. For us as educators, this one was a really important one. Collaborative meaning making from theory to practice. Any of you who are in teacher education will know that that theory-practice link is what we bang on about all the time. That it's not enough just to read about it, you have to bring the theory into your practice. This was an absolutely ideal opportunity to do that. It allowed us to continue to explore the idea of multimodal literacies. And one of my PhD students who's speaking later today, she's moved on to a completely new game in this, where she's looking at story apps, and she's really taking on a great deal of this further. And this is also so important in research. Research that embraces uncertainties and diversities. Sometimes your research needs to take risks. Sometimes your research needs to say, I don't know. It's a journey into the unknown. And so that's absolutely fascinating for people who have been working in academic environments for a long time. And then here's the other, sometimes unexpected, sometimes expected benefits. That we shared our beliefs and we were willing to embrace those uncertainties. That we had all the negotiation to do to make sure that there was academic collaboration, whose name came first, which university came first, where did the resources go, all these kinds of things. We were coming, in some cases, from quite different methodological traditions. We were working in English and Spanish and Catalan, which is obviously a language in Spain, and to some extent Scots, because we had the Glaswegian children who have their own dialect of Scots. And we had different versions of Spanish. Now, this one was a really interesting one to me because we had Castilian, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, Argentinian, and Spanglish, which I think is quite a wonderful idea. And then we also had the different Englishes in the United States and in Britain. Different spellings. You've no idea, writing the book, what that caused, the problems that caused. Are we spelling it with an S or a Z? Are we spelling it with an OU or an O? Are we spelling it? All of these kinds of things. The methods we talked about already, thinking about the terminology. And this one, again, so relevant to the previous talk, the nuances of academic writing in these different languages. And then the translation from the home language into English for publication. Our colleagues in Spain wrote their entire part of the research in Spanish. And so it was then translated into English. Evelyn, my colleague, is from Mexico, so she's obviously a Spanish speaker. Carmen in America is also, she's from Mexico, is also a Spanish speaker. What happened was that the manuscript came to me as the only native English speaker in the team, and I'm a Scot. But hey. And also, in our team were some people who were migrants. Evelyn and Carmen had both come from other countries to work with us. And some of our team, we had a Canadian PhD student working with us. So we had a really interesting mix of teams. Here are some of the things that we found with the children who worked with wordless picture books. They were shocked there were no words. When we brought this book in, one of them said to me, when are you bringing us the other book? And we said, what do you mean, the other book? The one with the words. They couldn't get their head round that this was a story told, a complex story told entirely with pictures. They then realised that they actually had to work at these pictures to get a meaning from them, to read into it. And even the children who were learning English, even the children who struggled with reading at all, they still kind of felt there ought to be something there. There's no letters in there. How will we make sense of this? What they then did was they then took on the role of the commentator. I think this is saying this. I think this, and they said it all in the present tense. There are a few pages, obviously, at the beginning of the book, for example, where you have what we would call the end papers, and where you've got the title of the book and so on. They get very hung up on pages with words because they think there's some kind of secret message here that they can actually get some clues from. And in fact, that's really an interesting thing. We spent a long time. They found in one of the pages what looked like a ticket, and they saw that it was a shipboard ticket to go to a country, and they saw the name Glasgow, and they zeroed in on that in Glasgow. It was really interesting. Then they start to look at more closely at the pictures. Then they start to speculate. Then they start to take risks. And the conversations that happened then for children who were not native speakers of English and also with the native speakers, then there started to be arguments. I think this. No, I think that. I think this is different. Well, I think, and because of this. And then the conversations started. They actually begin to select the readings. You can think that if you like, but I think that. And then when we asked them to tell us about the books, what they liked about the books, what they found interesting about the books, they started to say, makes you think more. You have to use your imagination more. And they then, but still trying to break them of that thing about the words is really, I don't know that we'll ever completely do that. One thing we did find, though, was if there was a teacher with them, or a mediator, an adult of some description, they tended to defer to their readings and their judgments. So we had to try and kind of encourage them not to do that. I'm conscious of time moving on, and I know we started late, but I'm going to kind of whiz through this next bit. So that took us from that was one multilingual, multinational project. There is a book that goes with it called Visual Journeys, and it just last year won the Edward B. Fry Award for the best piece of research in literacy development, and that was a really big deal for us. In Glasgow, all of the teams went on and did other things elsewhere, but in Glasgow we went on to another project called From Images to Words, which was funded by money from the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And in this one, this is what we were trying to do. We were trying to take some of the strategies that we had used in our first study, and we were trying to incorporate them not just with a small group of children, but with whole classes. And that may or may not include recently arrived children in the classes, but certainly most of them with children whose first language was not English. And what we were going to do was to try to link that with their home literacy practices. We were obviously sticking with the theme of migration and journeys, and what we were actually also going to do in this piece of research was we were going to bring in our teachers, the teachers who were working in the school, and get them to actually tell us about how well this was working or not with the children. Again, I'm not going to spend time on this, but be reassured there was a very strong theoretical framework. all of these kinds of studies and all of these kinds of backgrounds, it's very grounded in theory. But what was very attractive about this project was that there was a parallel research and evaluation strand. So we were using these visual strategies in the classroom in order to teach, and at the same time we were researching what was happening in the classroom, responses to the tools, and what were the long-term impacts. I'm going to jump to this one here about, oops, and I've kicked off again, sorry. This one, ethically sound research and evaluation work with children. When you work with subjects who are considered vulnerable, such as children, you obviously have to be hugely careful of the ethical constraints. What was good about this was also about their learning. We weren't doing something to the children, we were doing something with the children and for the children. And that was hugely important. And as you can see, for the good research design, it has to consider the impact on the children. So we also had 2 layers of research and evaluation. We had the teachers' thoughts and evaluations, and we have the children's. And these were the books that we used for this study. The first, The Rabbits, is also illustrated by Sean Tan. But if you look at this book and compare it to the Arrival, which was all in black and white, this one is so different. Written by John Morton, and this one is a cartoony book. This was one that the teachers chose, and it's about migration. It's an Australian book, particularly. We used a book called Jervely's Journey, which was a mixture of picture books and photography. This is a real live story. This girl, Jervely, was a refugee, and she actually came to talk in Glasgow about her experiences. And then a novel by the Australian Maurice Gleitzman, Boy Overboard. The boys loved this one. This was all about football, soccer, and that was really good. And then we created some new strategies to actually work with this. We used something about, we wanted to know a bit about what they were reading at home, what was their reading background. And so we called it this Rivers of Reading. We did some stuff about discovering the book. And then we used, again, the annotated spreads and graphic strips. This is something we call a River of Reading. We asked the children to make a collection of everything that had been read in their home that day. And so what we have is we've got some headlines from a magazine, the Sunday Times magazine. We've got some readings from Putting Down Roots. We've got a recipe. We've got various different things in this one. We have somebody who's completely obsessed with Justin Bieber. What can you do? And then we have, I just put some things in to show you the children working with the books in the classroom. We have to blank out their faces because we're not allowed to show them in that. And this is one of the annotated spreads. Now, this is obviously a child who is much, probably a home child rather than a newly arrived child. And this is an example of the detail of their reading of the picture. What are all the questions? And there's all kinds of things that the speculation, there's one point where he says the clouds look like ghosts. He's not quite entirely sure of what's going on there. This is the animation of the photographs and pictures. And this was a really interesting thing. The last book is entirely text. And when the children responded to it, they actually wanted to reverse the process. And they responded with pictures, which I think is absolutely fabulous. And I loved the fact that they had made that jump. So here are some, and I'm going to gloss over some of these quite quickly. Using these kind of strategies with children whose first language is not English and with native speakers levels the playing field. There's no words in the book. They can make the pictures themselves, or they can use these strategies to actually draw their responses. It hugely extended their language competence. It provided a way to clarify concepts and feelings. The affective domain in education is often overlooked, and it's so important. We actually began to see a gradual emergence of their home literacy practices. They were bringing us in books that were in their homes. They were telling their parents, this is what we're reading in schools. Multilingual texts. And then this got us thinking about these intercultural topics. The impact on the affective domain, broadening knowledge base, improving reading engagement, the thing I talked about at the very beginning, about the importance of this. And hey, guess what? Increased incidence of the pupil voice from both new arrival and host children. They started to tell us their stories. And then the teachers reported an impact on their practice. That's what we were looking for. We have a website, ta-da! It's called Journeys from Images to Words. You'll see it looks like a pinboard, and if you click on the various different post-its, that takes you to all much greater detail of the research. And you'll see, and this is something we're particularly proud of, this won the BIRA Research Prize in 2013. This prize is given for the best collaboration between a university and schools. And so we were terrifically honoured and pleased about that. That's what I mean when I say research with impact. Children's literature, so what? Well, actually, big deal. It is a big deal. And I'm going to finish and if you indulge me, I'm going to read this quote from Sean Tan. He wrote this for the preface for our book. In the absence of linguistic experience, we have all been in situations of dependence upon visual intelligence, making connections between things without the convenience of written or spoken meanings, and hopefully will continue to do so throughout our lives. At times, we must remind ourselves that meaning can be personally constructed, not just received from elsewhere, and that children and migrants know this acutely and from whom we have much to learn. It's at once a position of disability, not be able to read the world because of age or cultural difference, and also heightened ability, a privilege. It means you can be unfettered by the constraints of recognition, the automatic filing system that might stop us from really looking at things. In my book, The Arrival, I was not so much interested in imagining the life of a migrant as much as looking at how a migrant must imagine life, how we make sense of the world, how we ask questions, how we make connections. This is more important than knowledge. And I have to say, I think that's a great point for me to stop. Thank you very much.
From one Celt to another, Maureen, yes. Yeah. You reminded me about a great Irish poet, Seamus Heaney, and he talks about walking through the galleried earth.
Yes.
And the importance of creative perception in our teaching. I was particularly interested in the idea of visual annotation. As an A-level literature teacher in the past, of course, we had to do a lot of written annotation on the text, so I really liked that. And perhaps a call is required to return to classical education and the whole idea of aesthetic appreciation, which I think is something very important. Not to forget the emotion and the heart within, of course, the bounds of the new global order.
Yeah, thank you very much for your observation, and I think that's absolutely, I have a great deal of sympathy with that point of view, as you can imagine. I like the fact that you raised this issue because the previous speaker talked about the art and science of a PhD, and I think this very much comes under the art and also the heart of PhD, and I think that is absolutely something. I think that's something that we must pay attention to, because I think it would be a huge loss to us if we gave it away.
Thank you very much. I thought that was very inspiring.
Thank you.
You can't hear. Thank you very much. I thought that was very inspiring.
Thank you.
I'm Iman Gad, the Dean of Education. I just want you to tell me a little bit more about the selection of children who took part in that, because
in the first study, the main study that we did, we had a selection. We had a particular age group of children that we were focusing on. We then chose, we asked for volunteers, and sometimes that meant that families said no or yes. So we had basically children who had arrived within 2 years of the start of the study. Some were 2 years exactly, some had arrived 6 weeks before, so there was a very big mix. And in the first study, we also had equal numbers of home children. So within the studies, there would be something like 8 children in a class who were newly arrived and 8 home children. That was it. And we had several schools involved in that. And then in terms of the second project, we worked with 2 schools, and they came from various different parts of the city. One part of the city where they had settled a large number of asylum seekers. So in that school, there was quite a big distribution of recent arrivals and people whose first language was not English. The other school was a much better established school, much more mixed economy in terms of what they were, but they still also had children who were relatively recently arrived and also whose first language was not English. So we had two major schools in Scotland that were working on the Visual Journeys project, and then there were similar schools in Barcelona, in Arizona, and in Australia. So collectively, we had a large number of students. And then the second one, it was 2 schools and 2 classes, so about 30 children, 33 children in each of those. Okay.
Thank you very much. So how did it have a significant impact on the home children as well as the immigrant children?
Hugely.
And also, did it help integrate the immigrant children into, sorry, I'm not using the right term, but the immigrant children into to the community?
Yes, it
so
did.
So the home children better understood the immigrant children and the things they'd gone through?
Yeah, the answer is yes to both of those. The first project, the smaller number of children who were involved in that, but they went on that same journey through the book with the newly arrived children. And what they talked about was the fact that although these other children couldn't read in English, they could read the story from the pictures. They could see that exact journey that they had been on, and they could absolutely see that. In terms of the second project, the Esme Fairbairn project, all of the books that we used had a theme of migration and immigration. And in one particular school, this really fired them up. They wanted to do something about this. They wanted to say something about this. And that in turn inspired one of my colleagues, Julie, to take on another project called Journeys for Change, which is this idea of young people being inspired by what they've read or what they've learned from integrating with these people, and then wanting to tell people about it, share their experiences, do something about it. So that was it was a huge impact on the home children. And in terms of the integration, yes, both all of the teachers involved talked about far greater observation of integration with the children coming out of their shell, children being willing to try, have a go at things that they hadn't perhaps previously tried. So yes, I would have to say it has had a big impact. Thank you.
The storytelling and folklore is universal and in all cultures. How you analyze that to your research work? Because the storytelling to the children is have common concepts all over the world and folklores, and it also impacts the imagination
Yes.
of a child. So was it considered in your studies and research or not?
We took it, we talked about the fact that this was a book and a story, but we encouraged children to tell stories themselves, and we talked about how stories had come into being. We talked about stories that were passed on in families. We talked about traditional stories. We talked about how they get translated into books. So absolutely, the storytelling aspect was so important. What was fascinating, though, I suppose, was the idea that these storytellings could be real-life stories. And the fact that they had a story to tell. And some of them made a story using all their photographs of the things that were important to them and places that they had lived in their family room. We had one girl who was obsessed with Bollywood, and she took a picture of the screen at home with a Bollywood film showing. But that was her story. She wanted to tell us that part of it. So I completely agree with you that the storytelling is at the absolute heart of this. So we did use it. Thank you.
Okay, I've got a proposal to make. If we start at 11:35 with the first speaker, and the first speaker will, of course, be tolerant of a number of people coming in late. So if you've not been in the UAE for very long, you might find this difficult, but if you've been here for a while, you will be used to it. So I suggest we start at 11:35. Now, the reason for saying that is I know one or two people have taken time off work and unfortunately can't be with us, so they're coming to a schedule. So if we're only 20 minutes late, then no doubt their employer will be happy to wait 20 minutes. But if it's longer, we might lose one or two people because of the way they're trying to commit to the timetable. So we'll start at 11:35, but on the understanding that only the first speaker and the chair and one or two other supporters might be there, because obviously everyone needs to have a break now for 15 minutes. So that hopefully by the time we get to lunch, we'll be starting on time after lunch. We've got an hour's break for lunch. So we'll start at 11:35. We've got Auditorium, Engineering and IT are here. We've got RM3 practice proposals in Classroom 1. We've got RM3 education practice proposals in CR2, and a number of talks also in Engineering and IT in Classroom 3. And the chairs of that are Professor Halim Boussabain, myself, Dr. Solomon David, and Professor Bassam Abahijli. If, for whatever reason, the chair isn't there, can I ask a member of the Student Organising Committee to sub for them until they arrive? Or alternatively, if there isn't a student committee member, perhaps another member of staff can take over. So we'll have a break now and for 15 minutes, but the first speakers, if they could start at 11:35, and then people will come in after they've had a chance to have some coffee and tea and talk to some people. Okay, so enjoy the conference.